Okay, so we're just going to talk for a minute about freedom of speech and the evolution of freedom of speech. And there's a couple ways that we can think about freedom of speech evolving. Right? One is within the relative vacuum of the colonies, right? And the other is more formally or more officially through actual government institutions. Okay, so again, there's two kinds of freedom of speech. One that occurs more in a vacuum, the people just do it, and then the other is more through government institutions. So the first kind of freedom of speech, the one that just sort of happens. Now, first of all, we should hopefully know that in the Americas there's quite a lot more voting. Right? People are simply more involved in politics, more involved in what's often called the public sphere, thinking about and talking about what's going on in the world. Right? And this is because the primary constraint for voting in the old world was property rights. But in the new world, a lot more people can get property. It's a lot easier to get property, so a lot more people have property rights. Therefore, there's more voting. Okay, so from the get-go, more people are involved in the public sphere and more people are voting. And this leads to, in some states, quite a contentious atmosphere, right? Particularly in the middle states. Right? The middle states, also known as the Mid-Atlantic, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, right, are where some of the most contentious political debates began and where we see the most acrimony within the public sphere. And this, of course, is what we're getting to when we get to freedom of speech. Right? So, unlike in Massachusetts or in the Chesapeake, there's less decisions, less clarity of politics, so there's a lot more open discussion. Right? So much so that sometimes in the middle states this open discussion descends into rebellion. Right? So freedom of speech at its most extreme form can be rebellious. Right? And this brings us to this guy, Jacob Leisler. Right? So Jacob Leisler actually led a rebellion in New York, right, called Leisler's Rebellion. Right? In the late 1600s, after New York was taken over by the Dutch, this was a rebellion that stemmed from the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution, 1688, all of a sudden nobody understands who's in charge, there's a new king in England, and this guy Leisler just goes for it and tries to establish an independent colony in New York, primarily based on support from former Dutch people. Okay? Leisler is captured and executed. So Leisler's rebellion is a failure, is a brief example of freedom of speech getting out of control. Right? And it's one of several rebellions that we'll mention. We've already mentioned Bacon's rebellion in the Chesapeake. Leisler's rebellion was one in New York. Freedom of speech out of control. Right? But we also do see freedom of speech take some really positive steps in New York. And the best example of that is the trial of John Peter Zenger. So again, we've already said that New York was a political climate of acrimony, debate. And Zenger waded into this debate with his newspaper. Right? Now, his newspaper published criticism of the governor of New York. At the time, that criticism was against the law. Right? It was illegal in England to engage in what was called seditious libel. Right? Saying anything bad about the president, right? Or about the king was illegal. I was thinking president because I was thinking of something bad I could say about Barack Obama. For instance, Barack Obama is feckless. Right? That would be considered seditious libel, right? An insult to the leadership, even if it's true, which I would argue that it is. Right? So the king, right, could not be criticized. The governor could not be criticized. If you did, it was seditious libel. John Peter Zenger did it, and he went to trial. And this was the first time in a trial before his peers where the argument was, hey, listen, if it's true, don't convict him. And this was the first time that a jury did not convict based on the truthfulness of a printed statement, even if it was critical of the government. So the Zenger trial is the first time that we see freedom of the press. Right? We know that freedom of speech has sort of several subsets, right? There's actual speaking, then there's assembly when you gather together, and there's freedom of the press when you write something. All of these are forms of freedom of speech. So the Zenger trial is the first time that freedom of speech is allowed, even when it is criticism of the government, a very important step in terms of freedom of speech. Now that's the rabble. That's coming from the masses. But we also see freedom of speech coming within the political sphere, right? Specifically within government institutions. Two government institutions I want to talk about. town meetings and state legislatures. Right? Now, all the states had some kind of legislature. You may have heard of the House of Burgesses. That was the first legislature that was formed in the New World. They're also often called state assemblies. Right? So the state legislatures, also known as the state assemblies, they see their power grow in the 1700s because their economic power grows. The power of the local economic leadership increases, and they're able to challenge the governor of the colonies, who was appointed by the king. The best way that these elected assemblies could challenge the governor was through the power of the purse. As we are starting to realize, England did not have a lot of money. So in many instances, these governors were paid by the legislatures. So these state legislatures, these state assemblies, had the power to influence the governor and articulate their opinions, their freedom of speech, because they could control whether or not the governor got paid. Right? This was known as power of the purse. So we increasingly see the colonial assemblies developing more and more power to represent the people and to speak for the people beyond just trying to propose ideas to the governor that he could or could not veto. Right? So power of the purse helps assemblies. Finally, we see on the town hall level, increasingly local people are encouraged to participate. If they have property and they are male, and in many instances they are the correct religion, then any man can participate in local government. And we start to see what were considered blue-collar people, farmers, or tradesmen, or we're often called mechanics, participating in local government. So we start to see an opening of speech and an opening of participation in government going all the way back to the turn of the 1700s.